and welcome to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mideles, and I am your host here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of deep South Texas. We got a lot to get to today. A little bit in the newscast, we're going to hear from our El Paso correspondent, Julian Resendiz, who's going to bring us an update on a shelter just over the other side of the border in Juarez, which we've been telling you about over the last couple months. Our Sandra Sanchez is also going to have a massive update on a story that's actually making national news, and that is the update on those Guatemalan deportations. So we're going to hear from her in just a few moments on that. But first, let's take a look at the headlines making news across the border, starting with the show with breaking news out of Chicago, where the Trump administration has begun its crackdown on immigration, which it's calling Operation Midway Blitz. Now, in a news release issued just a few hours ago, the Department of Homeland Security said it is in honor of Katie Abraham. Now, she was a 20-year-old Chicago area woman who was killed in January in a hit-and-run crash, and the suspect was a Guatemalan man living in the United States illegally. DHS said for years Governor Pritzker and his fellow sanctuary politicians released Tren de Aragua gang members, rapists, kidnappers, and drug traffickers on Chicago streets, putting American lives at risk and making Chicago a magnet for criminals, end quote. This weekend, hundreds of protesters, as you can see on your screen, gathered outside the Great Lakes Naval Station in North Chicago. That's where the Navy actually holds their basic training boot camp. Now, they called it an emergency protest against the federal crackdown on Chicago. ICE is expected to use that base for training and planning for Operation Midway Blitz. Now, the president has repeated threats to add Chicago to the list of other Democratic-led cities he's targeted for expanded federal enforcement.
Are you threatening to go to war with Chicago?
When you say that, darling, that's fake news.
Well, why would you the Department of Defense?
Listen, we're not going to war. We're going to clean up our cities. We're going to clean them up so they don't kill 5 people every weekend. That's not war. That's common sense.
Now, our partners at News Nation have learned that an elite unit of Customs and Border Patrol is coming to Chicago to supplement ICE operations for what is expected to be a widespread crackdown on immigration. Also happening in Georgia, nearly 500 workers at the Hyundai supplier and LG Energy Solution plant Elabel that were arrested last Thursday by ICE agents will be sent back to South Korea. Now, 475 people were arrested on Thursday as part of a criminal investigation into alleged unlawful employment at the facility. Most of the detainees were South Korean nationals. Now, South Korea has announced that the United States has agreed to release the detained workers and that it would bring them home on a charter flight. The arrests at the Hyundai battery plant have caused confusion, a shock, and a sense of betrayal among many people in the key U.S. ally. South Korean analysts say problems in U.S. visa and immigration systems are colliding with President Trump's goal of having foreign companies finance a U.S. manufacturing renaissance. Immigration and activists say the use of ICE at the Hyundai plant was not about public safety, but was the weaponization of immigration enforcement in an economic dispute. Also happening, a legal aid group has sued to preemptively block any efforts by the U.S. government to deport a dozen Honduran children. The Arizona-based Florence Immigrant and Refugee Rights Project says it has credible information that such plans were quietly in the works. The group added Honduran children to a lawsuit filed last week that resulted in a judge temporarily blocking the deportation of dozens of migrant children to their native Guatemala. The amendment to the organization's lawsuit is sealed in federal court, and the Homeland Security Department did not comment. And speaking of that lawsuit, when it comes to the deportation of dozens of migrant children to their native Guatemala, let's bring in our South Texas correspondent, Sandra Sanchez. Now, Sandra, you've been kind of following this since the beginning. Kind of fill folks in on where what has happened and how we got to the point we're at today.
Right. Hi, Rudy. I have been. And can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
There we go. It has been described to me as utter chaos that the lawyers today held a webinar, and they explained how it went down Labor Day weekend, where 600 children, 90% of the children are indigenous from Guatemala. That's a quarter of all the children held by the Office of Refugee and resettlement were targeted to be put on planes and deported back to Guatemala. And you just mentioned that there we see the planes. They sat on the tarmac here at Harlingen Valley International Airport in deep South Texas for several hours. At least 76 children were loaded on those planes. Actually, one of the planes took off, but as you mentioned, there was an emergency hearing held by a judge in Washington, D.C. that was moved up several hours and issued a temporary restraining order stopping the deportation. The plane circled back and landed. Some of the lawyers described those children and themselves as being forever traumatized by that event. There is a hearing scheduled for Wednesday. They obviously want to continue with this restraining order, but the federal government says that these children were willingly wanting to be repatriated, and they and their families and the government of Guatemala want these children back. We have a little comment from one of the lawyers with the Young Center for Children's Immigrant Rights saying that they dispute that's not the case.
When kids are undergoing legal processes, there's a way that they can ask for voluntary departure, usually under safeguards, to be returned to their home country in a safe manner. That is not what was happening here. Contrary to the government's claims, these were not international reunifications or safe repatriations that were happening. Really what we saw play out, our child advocates who were working on the ground as well, alongside attorneys responding last weekend, what we really were seeing was the involuntary and unlawful return of children, the cancellation of hearings that kids had, and that legal process whereby they can ask for safe repatriation if that's what they wish to do. What we were seeing was an operation that was happening under the cover of night and not under the cover of law. It was not an operation that was respecting international or domestic law of that we have in the books for asylum. It was really refoulement that was happening. It was really the turn back of people seeking protection. In this case, kids in government custody.
Now, that was Gladys Molina of the Young Center for Immigrant and Children's Rights. She said, under the cover of darkness, let me just catch you up. It was the Saturday of Labor Day weekend, and after midnight, children in dozens of states who are in ORR custody were told, pack your bags, you are being sent home. Now, many of them had the wherewithal to say, I have a lawyer and I want to talk to them. And some were told they could not speak to their lawyer. Many did talk to their lawyers, and then that began this frantic phone calls and search for, and to try to find a judge and a hearing, and to try to file and to try to stop these flights. Now, as I mentioned, many children were brought here to South Texas, Rudy.
Yeah, what's interesting is I know you have spoken to federal immigration judges, retired immigration judges in the past about this very issue when it comes to children not really, knowing, and it's hard for an adult to wrap their head around a lot of the things that are going on. You're in a new country. You don't know all the rights afforded to you. Maybe now, you multiply that by 100 when you're a child. It just seems a little bit rushed. No?
That's what they're saying. And also, as I mentioned earlier, 90% of these children were indigenous, mm-hmm. meaning many of them don't speak Spanish or speak very little Spanish. And it was expected that they understood what was being said to them. Likewise, many don't speak English. We heard about 10-year-olds and 3-year-olds and 5-year-olds, a 17-year-old pregnant girl who says that her father was very upset when he found out she was pregnant. She fled to this country. She says that she has no one else back in Guatemala, and, he does not condone her having this baby, and she doesn't know what's going to happen. We just heard story after story. What really struck me was how affected the lawyers were. Normally, they're quite stoic and, like journalists, just repeat what they've seen. But there were a lot of tears shed today, and they even said, we're encouraging our colleagues to seek some sort of, counseling after this Labor Day weekend's events, because they are greatly affected.
Now, you mentioned these majority of these children being indigenous, and with that comes not speaking English or Spanish. It's whatever they're used to speaking in their rural communities in Guatemala. One of the things that the federal government had mentioned was communicating with the parents of these children. Did they have anything to say about that in today's conference?
Well, yes, and as you mentioned, there are 22 different Mayan cultures, so potentially 22 different dialects, and that's not the only, Mayan isn't the only indigenous culture. So there are very many there. They were actually tipped off by families from Guatemala contacting the lawyers, contacting the children, saying they got calls, your child's coming back, your child wants to come back. And then when they tried to reach the child, the last we heard, the child didn't want to come back. There is a big difference between repatriation and deportation. I think that's at the heart of this. The United States government is insisting that these children wanted to be repatriated back. Their families wanted them, and the Guatemalan government wanted them. What these lawyers are saying today is that these children, and they did not have the final removal orders. And that's key to this, because the judge said, if you do not have final removal orders, they will not be removed. And that's what the importance of Wednesday's hearing will determine, whether that still holds. But the judge said these children have applied for asylum. They want to stay here. And so they should not be forcefully sent. And now, like you mentioned at the top of the show, we've added a group of Honduran children that was filed on Friday to this as well. All in all, 600 to 700 children nationwide being affected by this. 1/4 of the 2,400 children held by the Office of Refugee and Resettlement across the country. I mean, it's a staggering number. They likened it to what happened in May of 2018 with child separation, and they just said the government was trying to not get it publicized and to do it on a weekend when people would be vacationing. And as soon as they got word of it, they all just basically canceled their vacations, sat by their phone, and they said that's how they worked it hard, and they stayed ahead of it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I do have just one last question before we get ready to go to a break. So where are all these children now? We know some of them were shipped down here to South Texas to catch their flight out of here back to Guatemala before it was returned. Some were taken to other parts. Where are all these kids now?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, they haven't left the country. Arizona, they were not sent from Arizona. They successfully argued. The Florence Project successfully kept those children there. But as you know, children who are in ORR custody are under the Department of Health and Human Services. And we can't ask specific information. If a lawyer represents someone, they can tell us about that child. Some of them are here. Some of them have been released to facilities here, and they're waiting Wednesday's court hearing. There were also some flights waiting in El Paso. So we know there are several different designations where these children are. Exactly, we don't know for sure.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sandra. We appreciate your reporting on this, and we'll definitely check in with you again on this on Wednesday to see if we can get an update. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Stay with us, because coming up after the break, our El Paso correspondent Julian Resendiz is going to bring us an update on a migrant shelter that's working to help those looking to cross the border but stuck in Juarez. Stay with us. We'll be right back. And welcome back to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles, your host here in Harlingen, Texas. Time now to bring in our El Paso correspondent, Julian Resendiz. Julian, today you're bringing us an update on a shelter that we've actually visited once before, correct?
That's incorrect, Rudy.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I apologize for that. We've been having some technical issues.
I see, okay.
In fact, right now I can't even see the screen, what's going on. But I can tell you, what we're doing is part of a larger story. There you go. There you go. Okay. Yeah. Let me tell you, this is part of a larger story that's going on throughout Latin America. And that is that countries whose citizens typically migrate to the U.S. are now finding themselves in a position of having to provide services for the migrants who are stuck on their way north and then found that the U.S. had closed its borders. And this is putting these countries, Mexico is one example, in a difficult situation. And that situation is being able to provide, to accommodate, at least temporarily, hundreds of thousands of migrants who didn't make it across the border in time before President Trump took over, and who now require services and are dealing with issues very particular to their travel and their condition. One of them is the mental health services. And we're talking about migrants who left from Venezuela, traveled 2,000 miles, left from Guatemala, traveled about 1,500 miles. And they're over here after a grueling journey in which they saw a lot of horrible things, including some of their peers dying either crossing the Darien Gap or falling off cargo trains in Mexico. So they have to deal with all this trauma. So and a few days ago, authorities in Mexico got together, and we're talking about government officials, nonprofit shelters, organizations that provide health services for the population in general, getting together and providing these services in one place for many migrants throughout the cities. We saw buses coming into this gathering place, which happened to be Casa del Migrante in the Zaragoza area of Juarez. They brought them from all over the city, and they made services available to them, including counseling, psychological counseling service, because of the things that they saw are so traumatic that it really changed their lives. We spoke to one male migrant who told us a little bit about what he dealt with on the trip.
I advise people that unless they have problems in their countries to stay where they are. They shouldn't come to suffer and bring their children or come because of the lie that the smugglers will get you across. It's not true. They leave you in the desert. I have seen it, and others tell me people coming with them stayed behind, died. That fills me with fear.
So that is the dilemma that Mexico and other countries are dealing with. How do we provide services? How do we make things better for these migrants? There's other questions, such as how do we integrate their kids into our school system, which already has shortcomings, overcrowding, lots of needs, and also the health system. So this is one example of this efforts being made at the grassroots levels in Mexico, and I'm sure it's also going on in other places along the way, including Guatemala, perhaps El Salvador, for the migrants who are stuck in their countries.
Now, Julian, one thing that gentleman that you spoke with mentioned was, kind of warning people to stay away. It seems like I've myself have spoken to migrants who, are staying on this side of the border in temporary shelters and protective services for one reason or another. And it seems like the message is always the same from these individuals that do make it up here. And that is, don't come, don't risk your life, and don't risk the lives of your family to get here, because it's not always going to be the dream.
Exactly, Rudy. That's what many of the migrants find once they embark on the journey. Because this particular gentleman, he told me that he was persuaded to come by some people who said, well, we can get you across into the United States. Never mind what you hear on the news. The border is open. We'll get you through. So what he's saying is, don't believe the lies of the smugglers, because the lies are out there. I mean, the smugglers know that the border is closed, but they still tell migrants that it's open. And what they see along the way is traumatic. That particular gentleman that we spoke to, he saw one of his travel companions fall off a cargo train. It get torn up by the train. He also was kidnapped himself, and he was only released after the smugglers realized, well, this guy really doesn't have any money. This guy really doesn't have any rich relatives in the U.S. So it's very traumatic, and it's one of the quagmires that Mexico and other countries along the way are finding themselves into right now. How do we accommodate? How do we provide? How do we make it better for these third country citizens that are here and are not going back?
One of the things that so often goes hand in hand with traumatic experiences or PTSD of any kind is the propensity afterwards and experiencing that event to maybe go down a rabbit hole and try to self-medicate with things like alcohol and drug abuse. Are there any stories of that happening up in that region?
Absolutely, Rudy. As a matter of fact, the Mexican border cities may be the wrong place to be when it comes to avoiding the ills of drug addiction, because the cartels are here, they're operating, and the cartels find themselves in a similar quagmire as the migrants. As the U.S. tightens the border, what do we do now? So they're starting to sell a lot, and I mean a lot of product in Tijuana, in Juarez, Nuevo Laredo, Reynosa. And I spoke to a drug addiction counselor in Juarez who works in a sector, in a working class sector where there's a lot of poverty and there's a lot of migrants. And yeah, absolutely, she says migrants are being approached by drug pushers. Let's hear from her.
Drug addiction depends on a lot of things, like where you are. In the case of migrants, they are in vulnerable areas. They are told, this will help you, this will give you energy. Meth is all over the city, so people can fall into this addiction.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's not just, we're not talking marijuana or the light stuff. She said meth, right?
That is the product of choice right now of the cartels, both as far as exporting. They're trying to substitute the fentanyl exports that the U.S. is so adamantly trying to stem. But they're also selling it on their side of the border. And yeah, methamphetamine consumption, they call it crystal or cristal. It is rampant in some sectors of Juarez. Not only that, so the migrants not only are at risk of being sold this stuff, consuming this stuff, being addicted to this stuff, but some of them are also being approached, I'm told, by local officials to sell drugs. Right now, the recruiting to sell crystal is all over the city. Migrants are no exception. So, yeah, it is a rabbit hole that they're in danger of falling.
Yeah, and that's definitely another added layer for the government, both municipal and state and federal government in Mexico to have to deal with is, when you don't have people working, they're going to find any avenue they can to make some money. And if pushing the crystal meth and other drugs is the way to do it, they're definitely going to be trying to do it.
Yeah, I would say not only the government, but those of us who live on the border and care about people on both sides of the border. There's plenty of nonprofits trying to help. So definitely, it's something that we all could get involved in.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your reporting on this, Julian. We appreciate it. We appreciate you working past those technical difficulties, too. Thank you, sir. All right. Well, that is some great reporting from Julian, but stay with us because coming up after the break, we're going to check in with our San Diego correspondent, Salvador Rivera, on some new smuggling issues they're seeing over on their side of the border. Border Report Live is back in 1 minute. And welcome back to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mideles, and I'm your host here in the Rio Grande Valley of deep South Texas. Now, the U.S. Border Patrol's San Diego sector has discovered smugglers are hiding illegal drugs, get this, inside car batteries. As our Salvador Rivera tells us, agents have seized several loads of narcotics hidden in vehicle engines.
80 to 90% of all drugs that come into the U.S. come through ports of entry such as San Isidro behind me. Lately, smugglers have been turning to an old method to get their drugs across the border. With tens of thousands of cars crossing the border daily, and as hard as Customs and Border Protection tries, it can't stop every load of drugs coming into the U.S. But in recent months, agents have been able to make several drug seizures away from the border.
We can say with reasonable certainty that narcotics are coming from Mexico through the ports of entry.
Joseph Root is a spokesperson for the Border Patrol San Diego sector. He told us agents are noticing a pattern.
Since about April of 2025, we've had 4 different seizures that involve basically removing the contents of a battery and using the battery as a concealment device.
Packets with all sorts of drugs have been found hidden in these car batteries.
The most recent was methamphetamine and cocaine, and the 3 previous smuggling loads were all fentanyl.
According to Agent Rude, this is another way smugglers are trying to get drugs into the U.S.
We've seen all manner of different methods of concealing narcotics, from car tires to baby car seats, hidden compartments, makeshift compartments, in the door panels, gas tanks. This is just a new method that we've started to see a spike in.
Root says drugs in car batteries is part of an increased effort by smugglers to recapture money being lost in other areas of their operation.
We've basically put a huge damper on their ability to smuggle humans, and so they're trying to make a buck in the easiest way possible. That involves narcotic smuggling, and we're here to stop that and protect our communities.
Salvador Rivera, Border Report.
Well, all right. Thank you so much for that, Sal. We appreciate your reporting on that very interesting new technique that smugglers are using to get drugs over the border. Don't forget, you can stay informed on the stories shaping the U.S.-Mexico border on your podcast, in podcast form, rather. Border Report Live is bringing you real-time updates, expert insights, and voices from both sides of the border. So make sure to like and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and the iHeartRadio app today. That's going to do it for us. Thank you so much to Sal, Julian, and Sandra for their reporting. And thank you for watching. Until tomorrow, have a great day.